Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is 5 years old this year. Released in 2016 as a sequel to 2013 Superman reboot Man of Steel and as the second in Warner Bros. Planned DC Extended Universe, Dawn of Justice depicts in a 3-hour, 3-minute runtime an encounter between Batman and Superman, who are both forced to fight each other when they are manipulated by egomaniacal supervillain Lex Luthor, who has a hang-up about God. Costing anywhere between $250 to $300 million, Dawn of Justice set box office records in its opening weekend, but after a prominent round of negative reviews and mixed word of mouth from audiences, the film saw a significant and historic 68.4% drop in ticket sales for its second weekend, from which it never recovered, despite facing no competition from other releases. Even though the film has turned a reasonable profit, Warner Bros. Consider the film to be a financial disappointment for failing to reach the $1 billion return that they had projected for. And it's one of the most god-awful movies I've ever paid to see. I want to be upfront about that just so I'm not wasting anyone's time. I hate this movie so much for so many reasons. It's ugly, mean-spirited, obnoxiously self-serious, arrogant, and a genuinely obscene waste of Warner Bros. Considerable money and resources. This video is not going to be about calling anyone wrong or evil or stupid for liking the material. This is entirely about me and my own relationship to it. It's been 5 years and my knickers simply shall not untwist about it. I'm also going to warn you, as you can see, this video is awfully long, and the reason for that is because I need to be thorough in order to properly explain and contextualize my thoughts, but to do so is really tricky because the film itself is such a mess that it kind of defies one's ability to be comprehensive. Like, there's just so many things that are wrong with it, but fortunately for us, they are ultimately centered around a truly abominable screenplay. What happened with Dawn of Justice is not a result of too much depth or complexity. There have been more complex blockbuster movies out there that are still more competently made. The core problem is that the story creates too many elements for the plot to consistently juggle and results in a narrative that's just bloated and unfocused. I mean, it's hard enough to construct a compelling mystery plot which ends in a collision between the two principal characters orchestrated by the villain on its own, but just becomes that much harder when it also has to share space with a subplot introducing Wonder Woman and future Justice League members, an entire dystopian vision complete with a warning from a character we haven't even met yet, and the birth of a science monster whose sole purpose is to kill one of the protagonists. The plot ultimately buckles under the immense heft of the story's weight, so instead of a narrative that's held together with plot, themes, and character arcs that work together and point in the same general direction, the film ends up being a giant bag of things loosely and awkwardly scotch-taped together. And that is basically the root of it. In a sentence, Dawn of Justice sucks because the plot is terrible. But that's not entirely it, is it? I mean, I want to be able to just say that this movie sucks and carry on with the rest of my life, but 5 years later and here I am. So let's take the time to properly unpack this, shall we? In the attempt to grapple with what the movie is trying to accomplish, I've seen it several times and I've crammed almost all the publicity material into my head for research, and a phrase that crops up multiple times is mythic, or mythology. This appears to be the starting point for what aesthetic space the movie is trying to occupy. Pretty much nothing that happens in the movie is due to anything human or relatable in a down-to-earth sense, but is presented more so in terms of grand opera or mythic tragedy, or perhaps more specifically the key creative's idea of grand opera and mythic tragedy. In other words, they seem to have taken the term comic book mythos a touch too literally. I imagine this thinking came from examining what they could do to differentiate themselves from Marvel and leaning hard on the fact that their characters are more readily well known. Like, you don't need to spend too much time re-explaining who Batman or Superman are, you can just present them as is and start going. See, contextually, this was Warner Bros. Gearing up to compete with Disney's Marvel Cinematic Universe, typically characterised by fun, hopeful optimism, with characters putting their differences aside to form a fragile alliance in the name of friendship and saving the world, each forming pieces of a larger whole. But previously, Warner Bros.' most profitable superhero movies have been Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, characterised by intellectualism about the nature of superheroes and authority, down-to-earth characters bound by realism, and exploration of their psychological depths. And the movies have a very passionate fan base to this very day, and are frequently cited by critics and audiences alike as the greatest in all of superhero fiction. So I can only imagine that if you're Warner Bros., this must have seemed like a complete slam dunk. Like, if we can create a central canon of superhero stuff around that type of material and hopefully turn a similar type of profit, we'll be laughing. The foundational idea here seems to be that whilst Marvel characters are ordinary people who conflict over how to be a true hero, the DCEU is a world of gods and monsters who conflict with their own humanity and struggle to fit into the world that they are ostensibly trying to save. Adding to which, the guiding hand of a filmmaker whose aesthetic preferences are led by Heavy Metal Magazine, Frank Frazetta paintings, Robocop, and 80s and 90s alternative superhero books like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. So what you have is what one might describe as a kind of mythic realism, in part because it both aspires for Wagnerian operatics and has to inherit Man of Steel as its leaping off point. Ultimately, the DCEU feels like an attempt to do superhero fiction with all the portent, sudden twists, and grim revelations of Game of Thrones. I say that not because I think that that's literally true, but because it is illustrative of the kind of territory that we're in. Snyder, Warner Brothers, and DC Comics are essentially trying to present the movie equivalent of prestige television. Characters think and act in terms of grand consequence, important players die very suddenly and dramatically, accompanied by a mocking sense of their futility, and there's a palpable cruelty with which the world operates, along with a kind of juvenile counter-dependency exemplified by the overt mistaking of joylessness for reality.
Welcome to the real world where everything is sad.
Now, if we're going to really wade into the deep end on this one, we need to first discuss Man of Steel. So, quick catch-up version. Warner Brothers needed to make a Superman movie to settle a rights dispute with the estate of co-creator Jerry Siegel, meaning if they couldn't get a Superman project underway before 2011, the Siegel estate was well within their rights to sue for potential lost revenue. Man of Steel specifically started life as an idea by David Goyer, which became a pitch by Christopher Nolan after he'd been asked by Warner's to help revitalise the character after coming off the back of Inception and just before entering into making The Dark Knight Rises. In essence, the pitch was to basically redo Superman's origin as an alien first contact story, i.e. Clark Kent has been soul-searching across the Earth looking to find his place amongst us whilst actively hiding his superpowers when his presence on Earth becomes known when Zod shows up and demands that Earth turn him over, creating unease, and Clark has to decide what he wants to do on the world stage before us, raising questions about our concepts of what it means to be human, forming the thematic spine of the film. In the process of becoming Superman, Clark ultimately decides to save Earth by rejecting the rebuilding of Krypton, effectively giving up on his last chance to return to where he came from, and thus solidifies his relationship with the world that raised him. Taken on its own, it's a decent idea. It's what they felt was their best foot forward in terms of how to present this character in a contemporary context. Nolan isn't particularly interested in directing it because he's about to go hard into production on The Dark Knight Rises and so settles into a producer role. And after a laundry list of directors that included Guillermo del Toro, Robert Zemeckis, Darren Aronofsky, Ben Affleck, Duncan Jones and Tony Scott, Zack Snyder is hired in October of 2010. Warner Brothers have a very good relationship with Zack Snyder because he won himself a whole bunch of goodwill with the studio when his 300 adaptation became such a big hit for them. It made an enormous amount of money for Warner's, twice what they had projected for, and the top brass personally thanked him with an Aston Martin Vanquish, a goodwill gesture that Hollywood execs typically don't do for talent anymore. The point is, Zack Snyder is a guy that Warner Brothers wants to keep working with. He was considered golden. So he comes on board, and with his input, the story starts to take more the shape of an action movie, which is really what he was hired for, with Snyder's personal goal being to revitalise the character for a modern audience.
Because I think Superman is broken, and I think it needs to be fixed. It's not like from a movie standpoint. From a movie standpoint, I think that it is he's the biggest superhero on the planet. He's the why of all superheroes, the father of every superhero.
Supposedly, when they were developing it, Snyder sat down with the storyboard artist Jay Oliver and looked at Dragon Ball Z and a lot of anime inspiration for the action. In particular, they wanted to capture the tone and energy of this scene from Birdie the Mighty Decode in the final fight between Zod and Superman. Which, I mean,
isn't a bad idea in and of itself, but we kind of have an issue now.
We've got a philosophically minded alien contact Superman from Goyer and Nolan sitting side by side with an aggressive, destructive Dragon Ball Z Superman from Zack Snyder and his production team, and these two things are somewhat in conflict with each other. Both of those are seemingly motivated by different objectives, and subsequently creates two Superman movies going in two different directions simultaneously, neither of which intends to live near classic Superman. So it becomes a thoughty, big ideas sci-fi drama that's frequently interrupted by giant explosions and violent punching sessions so as to engage the audience through action, including but not limited to an entire third act that detours into mass destruction sequences deliberately visually reminiscent of 9/11, complete with an ending that left a sour taste in just about everyone's mouth, where Zack Snyder and David Goyer manufacture a situation where Superman has to kill Zod, or else he'll kill everyone.
Now, I think I get why this decision was made. Zack Snyder said that it was a means to establish Superman's moral code, perhaps by tying it to the death of his home planet, maybe? That's my best guess for what he meant, but regardless, it was controversial to say the least.
Part of the wider idea was they wanted to take Superman out of his colourful world and plant him down into reality and see how much his presence would change our universe in a Dr. Manhattan Watchmen kind of way. There's an inherent problem though in that it's entirely reliant on our understanding of Superman as the greatest superhero of all time, our champion of humanity, hope and optimism, and that this is about his contemporary struggle to achieve that relationship with us humans. And yet the movie doesn't really know how to present him like that. The entire movie, characters talk forever about how Superman will be a god amongst humanity and an inspiration to race behind, and yet the climax has barely anything to do with creating that relationship with humanity and everything to do with two near invincible aliens trying to punch each other to death. One of the core themes of the movie is Clark overcoming his fear of being rejected by people if he reveals himself, but his interactions with humanity across the film are almost entirely second-hand. He develops a relationship with Lois and the military, but not the public at large. Superman never risks rejection on his own terms prior to Zod showing up, and by that point he just flexes in front of the military because he knows that they're going to need him to save the world. So his personal insecurities that the story is built around just disappear. So in that final sequence where Zod trains his heat vision on innocent civilians, they're ultimately just human props. They mean absolutely nothing to the story as a whole because the movie hasn't demonstrated why Superman cares. If anything, there should be soldiers in their place, seeing as how preoccupied with military authority the rest of the movie is. Quite aside from that, the story is held together by and relies upon a pointless MacGuffin to drive the central conflict. They need a reason for Zod to follow Superman to Earth, so he's looking for the codex from the ship that Superman was sent to Earth with so that he can rebuild Krypton on Earth. Superman doesn't want to give it to him because Zod is basically Space Hitler, but it turns out it doesn't matter anyway because the data from the codex is transcoded into Superman's bloodstream, so he just needs to kill Superman and use his blood to birth a new legion of Kryptonians.
God, that sounds so eugenicsy when you say it out loud, doesn't it?
I gave it my best go, but I really wanted to like Man of Steel at the time. But my opinion on it has rather soured in the years since its release, especially given what it leads into. The ultimate reason why I'm labouring to describe all of this for you is that Man of Steel really is the original sin here. Because Warner Brothers needed a Superman movie on the docket to avoid potentially losing billions of dollars of their estate to the original creators, they threw something together that needed to work in the short term of being a hit film and maintaining one of their principal IPs with a creative team that, crossed fingers, will click together on this particular character, but later needed to commit to it in the long term of starting and shaping a shared universe in the same competitive category as Marvel. This is basically like, what if the Amazing Spider-Man had to later turn into its own Oh, hang on. The problems that Man of Steel has exist on a larger canvas for Dawn of Justice. There are a million billion ideas present in the text for what this thing could be, but none of them appear to see eye to eye and end up clashing profoundly with the shape the movie is trying to form.
Like, in terms of second steps after Man of Steel, how could it be anything but Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice? When it comes to shared universes, what Warner Brothers were really looking for is someone akin to a showrunner, i.e. someone who knows how to plan long term and have consideration for how all the disparate pieces are going to fit into the larger whole. And if Zack Snyder could plan long term, his movies would have better stories. So we're going to officially start the autopsy by talking about how the plot is an absolute nightmare.
As a sequel to Man of Steel and as a story prequel to Justice League with functionally 2 third acts with 2 different emotional climaxes, it is an absolute unholy mess of storytelling. There are all these moving pieces that the narrative is trying to juggle, and they all actively get in the way of the ability to follow the central conflict, which should be easy because it's the title. The principal issue with the project as a whole is that it's just wildly unfocused, with its priorities in the wrong place. There's severe structure and pacing issues, the first half is lacking any strong sense of forward momentum, plot threads become abandoned as the movie refocuses towards the climax. The main story is frequently interrupted by bloated side content that sets up future sequels and does nothing to advance the story. There's functionally no foreshadowing for later events, and several characters who seem like they're going to be vitally important to the story overall abruptly disappear at the halfway mark.
A lot of the issues that we're about to discuss are rooted in how they seemingly wanted to get to Justice League as quickly as possible after Man of Steel, and because there's not really much to Man of Steel, almost all of its future setups and world building need to occur in this movie. In terms of what we're dealing with here from a sequel baggage perspective, this is like the difference in scope between The Matrix and The Matrix Reloaded.
Having world building be a part of your narrative isn't inherently a problem, but it is when it's gone on for several minutes at a time and you've lost track of what your core story is, and even then, its alleged core story is a bad joke of unfolding plot threads. Like, if you thought The Dark Knight Rises was needlessly overcomplicated, you ain't seen nothing yet. So we open on 2 prologues where we re-establish Batman's origins and him being on the ground floor during the Battle of Metropolis, which sets up the central conflict straight away. Batman is distrustful of Superman because of what he allowed to happen to Metropolis. At this point, bewilderingly, the movie decides to separate out into a whole bunch of subplots. Superman is being made accountable for his recent intervention in a US military operation where he takes down an African warlord and further destabilizes a region, so his plot is about him dealing with the court of public opinion and his role as a force for good. Batman is on the trail of a Russian weapon smuggler who's in contact with Lex Luthor, which also puts him in the path of mysterious antique dealer Diana Prince. Lois Lane is investigating a mysterious bullet which uncovers a conspiracy to frame Superman. At his day job, Clark Kent is investigating and looking to do a hit piece on Batman's cruel vigilantism, which for whatever reason Perry White doesn't care for him doing. And Lex Luthor is trying to convince Senator June Finch to allow him to import kryptonite into Metropolis so that he can use it to protect Earth from anything like Zod if it shows up, which is declined, but he manages to get access through one of her lackeys to Zod's body and the Kryptonian ship he came in, for reasons that will become apparent later.
It's this dearth of subplots that really trips people up when it comes to critical analysis, because the problem with this stuff isn't that it's too deep or too complicated, it's just that it's painfully inefficient. See, the thing about having multiple subplots that work together to tell a whole story is that the narrative has to emerge slowly in order to account for everything that's going on, so then we, the audience, can track those developments. And this is an issue that's made far worse by how rigid and compartmentalized the plot actually is. This is why the Ultimate Edition is a hair over 3 hours long, not because they've got 3 hours worth of story to tell, but because it's written in such a fractally padded way.
It's at its worst during the first half, where nearly a full hour goes by of introducing these various threads and nothing has actually advanced the plot. Batman's antagonism towards Superman set up in the prologue remains largely untouched by these threads, and it develops in a very indirect way, especially since Bruce is primarily on the hunt for the White Portuguese, which no one cares about until only later when it turns out to be the shipment of kryptonite to Lex Luthor. The only thread that directly furthers that conflict is how Clark pushes against Perry White to run his story about Batman being a sadist, but it gets so little traction and after a certain point it just vanishes. The main story only really starts to pick up when it's revealed that Batman plans to intercept the kryptonite to use for his own ends, where he and Alfred actually talk about the ramifications.
And we have to destroy him. But he is not our enemy.
But by this point we've already cleared an hour and 10 minutes. It leads to a car chase, Superman intervenes, they goad each other, and the kryptonite is delivered to Lex. So nothing of any real note has actually taken place plot-wise, nothing is gained or lost, we just need an exciting action scene because we haven't had one of those in a while, despite it having no real consequences. And then soon after we start making headway towards the Senate hearing and the plot kicks into high gear with the bombing of the Capitol.
Incidentally, the bombing of the Capitol, wow, that's just so not cool now.
After which Batman just swipes the kryptonite off screen, so great use of your screen time, guys. And Lex kidnaps Lois and Martha in order to set up that title fight. And so the core of the movie ends up being so badly developed and ill-defined that it basically boils down to Batman wants to kill Superman because he's a paranoid fantasist who thinks he'll subjugate the human race, and Superman wants to kill Batman because otherwise Lex will kill his mum.
And that's it. That is what 2 whole hours worth of plotting gets you.
All of that plotting ultimately becomes so inconsequential given what it sets up. It pedantically covers their tracks in order to adequately set up that big important mythological title fight, but at the expense of actually developing the story. The core conflict just isn't developed meaningfully by how the plot is arranged, especially in the way that everything suddenly gets a move on after the Capitol scene. If anything, the plot itself works as a cover-up for the fact that the conflict between Batman and Superman is ultimately so very shallow. So rather than having a story solely about Batman making preparations for his inevitable confrontation, here's a bunch of subplots that loosely points towards our intended end scenario. A crucial aspect to this is that when the bombing of the Capitol happens, almost all the plot threads it took to get here are just put in the shredder. Lex needed Wally, the anti-Superman activist who agrees to testify, on his side to plant a bomb on him to enact the explosion. Senator June Finch dies in that explosion, and Kahina Ziri, Lex's false eyewitness account of Nairobi, is pushed in front of a train by Anatoly before the bombing takes place. And in terms of its wider effect on the plot, it doesn't actually matter that the Capitol explodes and a bunch of characters are now dead, only that Bruce Wayne sees it happen on the news and motivates him to make his stand against Superman, which he's more or less already planning to do, what with him tracking the kryptonite shipment. More or less everything that the first half of the movie is about doesn't have anything to do with the second half by the time that we get to it. They start off with an elastic bandball of subplots that only exist to move parts of the plot around, which then aggressively vanish when the story decides to recenter on Batman versus Superman. The prominent plot threads that carry over after the Capitol are Superman and the Court of Public Opinion and Batman's suicidally paranoid plot to assassinate him, aka a carryover from the last movie and something that was already established at the 9-minute mark. Lois Lane's plot also carries over in her tailing behind Lex Luthor in his conspiracy, but her plot develops so slowly and appears so infrequently that you just don't pay attention to it, and then after a certain point she just gets snatched by Lex's goons and then it's a mad dash to get to that title fight. Because really, the narrative utility of Lois overall is that she's following a bullet that points her at Lex specifically so she can be kidnapped to bring Superman out of exile and set up that title fight, and then she has nothing to do for the rest of the movie except be mournful when Superman dies. So again, all of that tangled plotting in the first half only to move parts of the plot around in order to set up a linear succession of overlong action beats in the second half. And then, even after the central conflict finally comes to a head and is resolved, where the story they set up between Batman and Superman is just about concluded, there's still slightly over half an hour hanging off the back end of what should be the climax.
This is what I mean when I say that the movie is so painfully inefficient. Having to watch Dawn of Justice for the purposes of review actively becomes a chore because it becomes so apparent that nothing the first half sets up will have any bearing on the latter half, and the ending goes on for far too bloody long to accomplish something so straightforward. It's shocking how busy and languorous the plot is relative to how wafer thin the story is. In so many ways, the plot feels like it was constructed out of pure pedantry rather than any good reasons to tell a 3-hour story.
The most glaring example being that they clearly decided early that they wanted Batman to have kryptonite on hand so then he can have any kind of a chance against Superman. But that means that they now have to establish where the kryptonite came from because it's just not really a thing in Man of Steel. So at the very start of the movie, after the 2 prologues, they show that parts of Zod's terraforming device from the last film are made of kryptonite. But how does it get into Metropolis from the Indian Ocean? Well, there's a Russian arms dealer who's trying to sneak it in through Gotham Harbour for Lex Luthor to help protect the world from metahumans because Lex is being denied an import license from Senator June Finch to bring it in. Batman is tracking the arms dealer and thus tracks the shipment, which leads to an entire extended car chase in his Batmobile, which is ended by Superman swooping in to stop Batman. But then later the Capitol building explodes with everyone inside it, and this causes Batman to break into LexCorp to steal the kryptonite for himself and fashions it into weapons for use in his final confrontation with Superman.
All of that takes about 17 minutes of screen time, and all it does is put kryptonite in Batman's hands.
Also, they wanted Wonder Woman in this, in her first movie appearance ever, because they wanted her for that ending with Doomsday, but now she needs something to do for the rest of the plot. So they set her up at Lex's cocktail party 47 minutes in, where she snatches Bruce's thumb drive for her own ends, but then gives it back to him when she can't open it for herself. Bruce decrypts it and finds out about the White Portuguese, and then nearly an hour after that, Diana has the additional files from Luthor's drive sent to her by Bruce, which is where we get that trailer segment before the big fight, like it's half-time at the Super Bowl. And then Diana is just about to board a flight out of Metropolis, which is grounded because of the fight with Doomsday, at which point she jumps in for the save.
That's all 8 minutes and barely touches the rest of the plot, which any decent editor will tell you should have been dropped entirely.
During the movie, they wanted Superman on trial so a bomb can go off and make him culpable in the eyes of the world as part of Lex's plan. So one of the earliest major scenes is Lois going to interview an African warlord in Nairobi, which goes south when her assistant Jimmy Olsen turns out to be CIA and gets capped in the head, and Lois is taken hostage. At which point, Russian mercenaries hired by Lex Luthor posing as henchmen kill everyone in the compound and burn the corpses, so when Superman turns up to avert a drone strike and save Lois, he's deemed responsible for the casualties, which is corroborated by false testimony from Kahina Ziri. But in order for Superman to be called to testify by June Finch, Lex has to also involve an anti-Superman activist who suffered as a result of the Battle of Metropolis, who gets his own introductory set piece vandalising a statue from whom Lex is diverting insurance payments from Wayne Enterprises, and encourages him to testify in order to hide a lead-lined bomb in his wheelchair just to blow up the Capitol. Oh, and Kahina Ziri is nonchalantly pushed in front of a train before the bombing starts.
That's all about 15 minutes worth of screen time just to set up one scene, and again, it feels overcomplicated. All they really need is a bomb to be in the Capitol to make the plot happen, so they overdevelop two side characters to be drawn into Lex's scheme. Now, I'm describing all of this to you because this is all material that the movie feels the need to include in order to tell its story, but when it comes to setting up that climax,
Lex Luthor gains access to the Kryptonian ship and Zod's body 32 minutes in. He uses Zod's fingerprints to get inside and learns all the information that it has to offer before placing Zod in the Genesis chamber with a sample of his own blood, and creates Doomsday for an extended 21-minute action sequence at the end.
The setup, 5 minutes across 2 hours 20. No expense is spared for how Batman acquires kryptonite, but near zero effort to gain access and create the giant boss monster that kills Superman at the end. So obviously I can't speak definitively as to why the plot is this incompetent because I wasn't in the room whilst it was being created, so all I can really offer is just my own intuitions, and for me it largely comes down to the set-piece centric way that Snyder's filmography is seemingly so often constructed.
So in terms of important set-piece stuff, they clearly wanted it centred around that fight from The Dark Knight Returns, complete with Batman's chunky armour and kryptonite weapons, and prior to that, they wanted Bruce's CrossFit montage of him getting ready for it because macho. They also wanted a brief montage of his origins because restaging that is always money, and his point of view of the Battle of Metropolis to set up the main story. They wanted a montage of Superman doing heroic feats. They wanted him to be on trial before the public because that's a strong visual. They wanted a shot of Superman dead in space just like in The Dark Knight Returns. And they wanted Superman to be actually dead by the end in order to create jeopardy for Justice League. They decided that they wanted Doomsday on hand in order to facilitate that, and they decided that they wanted Wonder Woman as part of the finale as well because they wanted at least one shot of the Trinity together before Superman dies between movies. They also wanted a car chase with the Batmobile involved, an extended warehouse fight with Batman taking down a room full of henchmen, and they wanted Batman's intro to be him branding someone to show how fallen he is as a hero. They wanted Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent's first encounter to be at a cocktail party hosted by Lex. They wanted a giant statue of Superman for a character to vandalise, and for some reason they wanted Batman to have a psychic nightmare about a future in which Superman subjugates the human race.
Aspiring screenwriters in the audience, I dare you to create a competent plot using all of that material.
It makes a certain amount of sense that Zack Snyder came up as a commercials and music videos director because these ideas are essentially money shots, which it's his job to guide the story through. All of these set-piece moments are what the film has been specifically designed to include, but none of them really come together and complete the film as a whole package because the story that drives through them isn't good. In fact, it's precisely because of its set-piece-centric approach to assembling narrative that the plot struggles to function as badly as it does.
I mean, this is kind of the reason why Zack Snyder has made something of a career of adapting other people's material, because he has such a hard time constructing narrative otherwise. Case in point, has anyone rewatched Sucker Punch recently?
I will say, sometimes this process results in hilarious story edge cases to get it all to line up, like how after the capsule bombing scene, Superman goes into self-imposed exile only for him to return a few scenes later when we need him for that title fight, and he just doesn't learn anything that substantial in the mountain scene. Or how Lois throws away the kryptonite spear into a pool only to then need it again a few minutes later to help kill Doomsday. Or how Superman intervenes in the car chase just to stop Batman and manages to completely ignore the kryptonite out in the open. Or how a missile is fired into Superman and Doomsday in space. Superman technically dies, recovers, and just comes back to Earth like nothing happened. My personal favourite, though, is this non-moment where Bruce dejectedly stares at the batsuit which they used in the first teaser. It feels like a scene that belongs in a story where Bruce has been retired for years, like in The Dark Knight Returns, and is contemplating coming back, especially seeing as the previous scene is Alfred telling him that he's not going to need the suit to infiltrate Lex's mansion, and how a lot of Bruce's scenes are him doing James Bond antics as himself. But he's already used the batsuit in the first scene with the human trafficker, so this moment just doesn't mean anything. I mean, if anything, it accidentally implies that he's rather immaturely just a bit sad that he can't go to Lex's mansion with the suit on this one time.
There's a whole bunch of stuff that I haven't even bothered to describe yet. Like, there's a whole nightmare future dream sequence.
It takes up a whole 5 minutes that feels like 20 minutes and is just Batman dreaming of a dystopian nightmare future in which Superman turns evil and subjugates the human race, which turns out to be a side effect of a time-travelling Flash cameo. The hilarious thing about this is that the context for it is a bit of a moving target. They set this up here as if it's going to be incredibly necessary for the plot of Justice League, but the 2017 theatrical cut didn't contain any material remotely like this, nor does really the main body of Zack Snyder's director's cut. They added a superfluous bit after the credits in 2020 reshoots to reference back to this scene, and it doesn't go anywhere. So 5 years and counting, and we still don't have enough context for these scenes to actually matter. On paper, it's supposed to help fuel Batman's paranoia about Superman, but it's just so out of nowhere and overt to the point where it's just trying too hard.
Though what matters most is where it's placed. Almost an hour of the movie has been cleared at this point. Lois has just found out that her mystery bullet is made of some unknown material and confronts Swanwick about it. Lex has recruited Wally into his scheme. Clark is looking into Batman and is at loggerheads with Perry White. And Bruce has just got his thumb drive back from Diana to decrypt for himself. So anyway, here's a short film about future Batman on the hunt for some kryptonite.
Ultimately, the movie doesn't know what its core story is, and subsequently doesn't know what story elements it actually needs in order to tell it. The first part, and its dearth of subplots, is the carryover from Man of Steel, which explodes with the bombing of the Capitol. Lex's plan is revealed, and then Superman is blackmailed into fighting Batman in Climax A, which then stops after a short while and it becomes the prequel for Justice League when Doomsday and Wonder Woman show up in Climax B. And what's bothering me about all of this is that it really wouldn't take much at all to get this up to the level of decent if you just excise some of the unnecessary plot bloating. Because there is something to the idea of Bruce Wayne being distrustful and angry in a post 9/11 type situation, and Lex Luthor's plan to create a theatre of conspiracies using politics and media coverage as his finger puppets helps tips Bruce's distrust into outright hostility and is led blindly into violence because he doesn't know how else to make the nightmare stop. That is the germ of an idea. The immigrant aspect of Superman's character is a good angle to play up, but it should be that instead of him as a deity, as he comes to be victimised by a society that sees his presence as inherently threatening, which better sets up that culminating moment where Bruce is finally able to see Superman's inner humanity. And that final set piece should be those two versus Lex Luthor, because he is the disrupting element here and not Doomsday. And if Superman absolutely needs to die, apparently, then just have Lex do it. I mean, that just makes way more sense to me, and it wouldn't be dumbing the movie down to do so. It would just be a more streamlined and concentrated version of itself. It would also work to clarify the most coherent thematic assertion of Dawn of Justice, which is the need for heroes in our awful, cynical modern world, our need for a modern mythology, and how our world very often kills them.
Good morning, Smallville. The American conscience died with Robert, Martin, and John.
When the planet was founded, it stood for something, Perry.
And so could you if it was 1938, but it's not 1938.
Men with power obey neither policy nor principle, Miss Lane.
No one stays good in this world.
Man made a world where standing together is impossible.
Men are still good. We fight, we kill, we betray one another, but we can rebuild. We can do better. We will. We have to.
This is material already present in the movie, dying for air amongst all the other stuff crammed in out of insecurity, and the problem is that they ultimately fat-fingered it. Bottom line is, they overdeveloped the first half of the movie as a means to artificially prop up the importance of the explosive and violent back half, and there really is no reason for this movie to be this narratively busy. They start off with a spaghetti tangle of plot threads that aggressively thin out as we head towards the second half, where it starts prattling off a succession of bloated action scenes. They wanted a movie that was epic, eventful and iconic, resulting in a film that is absolutely bursting with stuff that it does not know how to organise.
And that is really the root of it. This is the kind of movie that is entirely coasting on the notion that Batman and Superman being in the same movie and squaring off in it would be culturally significant, but they ended up overcompensating and over-designing when it came to making that premise work as a story. So now I think we should turn our attention to our dramatis personae.
So, given how the overall plot is very muddled, it creates the knock-on effect of being just that much harder to drive character arcs through it, so as a result, the movie's characters are rather terribly sketched.
Now, let's clarify something right here and now. The movie has bad characterization not because they don't act like their classic versions. The movie having alternate characterization is a contentious aspect of the movie, but saying that would kind of sidestep the core problem.
The fact that they're going with new alternate takes doesn't have to be a problem. The filmmakers want to stake out their own territory in terms of who these characters are, and it's not a requirement for them to be depicted as who they have been canonically, so this is just an aspect of the film that needs to be accepted. I will say that there are potential problems in the sense that audiences do have expectations, and even if you do intend on subverting them, you still need to meet them where they're at, and the film's willingness to go to such extremes in characterization is an aspect that stops most from engaging with the work. This is what critics and audiences mean when they say that Batman and Superman are unrecognisable here. It's not so much a criticism of the fact that they are alternate takes, but instead points towards an unacceptability in the specifics of what they came up with and where they intend to go. It also reveals quite blatantly that the key creatives have very particular ideas about who Batman and Superman are in the mythic realism context the movie wants to occupy, and that these are kind of at odds with what most would recognise as Batman and Superman. On the one hand, these characters are billed as gods amongst humanity and the basis of our myths in an attempt to create synergy with how we recognise DC's characters in our universe, and yet their willingness to go with dark alternate takes actively keeps audiences at an emotional arm's length from the story that they've created.
I mean, there's a general problem in that the movie is essentially trying to have it both ways, because on the one hand, they want to have a story about the deep moral need for a modern mythology, and on the other hand, they also want to expose these characters as fundamentally inadequate in a contemporary framework, and as a result, both of those feel incomplete and insincere.
It's part of a wider problem with Snyder's filmmaking generally, where he has something of a bad habit of relying on iconography to do storytelling for him, which frees him up to focus on his own pet interests, and sometimes this butts heads with other aspects of the filmmaking. So in this instance, the movie is leaning very heavily on presenting Superman with the reverence and gravitas befitting Christopher Reeve, but the character himself is very overtly not that. They're trying to engage in a meta-level conversation about these characters, but that gets muddled and ultimately lost in the specifics of their interpretation, and in doing so, they end up presenting who they would prefer Superman and Batman to be, and treat the correctness of that as self-evident, because look at these classic Superman and Batman images.
But the key thing I find is that who these characters have been canonically is not quite as interesting to Zack Snyder as what he, the auteur, can do with them.
So, as we discussed earlier, part of the overall goal with this character is to help revitalise Superman for a contemporary audience, in particular, the Dark Knight's audience. A large part of this is in how the story they construct is one in which Superman's godliness makes him an outsider to Earth and its people, with him having to struggle with that as a conflict, and the other part being to show Superman's might in an adrenaline-fueled, high-octane manner, namely that climax to Man of Steel. This time around, the film is a more grounded drama, more so focused on the fallout from the previous movie and Superman's sense of place in a world that is now very aware of him. There's near constant talk about the political and societal implications of his existence, speculation about his motives, why he's here, and what he means. It's all an attempt at being a galaxy-brain Superman story.
We're talking about a being whose very existence challenges our own sense of priority in the universe.
Now, as things go, I actually happen to like this idea. It's a smart way to continue the thread from Man of Steel, and it shows the reverb of Zod's invasion having ramifications for Superman after the fact.
It is a good idea to have this story be about trying to win the trust of the world that he's trying to save as a consequence. It's a very bold move and a modern way to present this character. Just like Watchmen, the movie wants to demonstrate through Superman that doing the right thing can be really hard in a modern context, that actions taken, regardless of intent, have consequences, and those consequences create public perception. As one character asserts, every act is a political act. Things can be morally complex. He can't just make the world better as an inherent product of his his existence because making the world better will have consequences that people won't agree with. There's laws, government, and democracy itself that stops him from doing just whatever.
This is incidentally why so many have read an explicitly Randian interpretation into this version of the character, the idea that Superman is held back by society and its government and just needs to be allowed to be exceptional, to be allowed to express his might upon society and make the right decisions for us as he sees it.
It also bears noting that Zack Snyder is nominally an objectivist, ? For more specific parallels, check out this really great video by Curio. I mention it not because I have anything to add to what's already been said about Zack Snyder's political views, but because I don't think it's entirely possible to separate either Dawn of Justice or Man of Steel from the worldview they both come from, which is in part why it matters when people say that Superman and Batman are unrecognisable in this film. I'm personally unsure myself, but if true, it would explain why he's so drawn to depicting these characters as untouchable demigods. But anyway, this interpretation of Superman also works in tandem with the mythic context the movie tries to occupy. With the starting premise about the need for modern heroes in our cruel world, the story for Superman to interact with is one in which he is an all-powerful god whom humanity is naturally distrustful of and must be kept in check, but results in him dead at the hands of a rich and powerful human who opposes Superman's objective right to power.
But the way that this thread is dealt with, though, for me at least demonstrates two core problems. The first is that it fundamentally fails to grasp Superman's altruism, which is more or less the centre of his character and the reason why he's a superhero. And the second problem is that with the story supposedly being about the modern world killing our gods and heroes, we're not exactly encouraged to feel the weight of that tragedy through this character.
Like, there's a contradiction here. He's presented as a powerful individualist who wants to be allowed to use his own power for his own reasons and has to conflict with society itself in order to do it, and yet his death is framed as a supposedly great emotional loss to the people of the world. I mean, Clark doesn't actually seem to care for the lives he saves that aren't Lois Lane and Martha Kent, and doesn't have a particularly strong sense of why he should be Superman beyond a begrudging sense of stoic duty for both his dead fathers, and helping people doesn't seem to actually fulfill him. It's a problem caused by Man of Steel, in which there's no moment where Clark decides to become Superman on his own terms. He just shows up at the scout ship and is basically handed his identity and destiny, and decides to condescend himself before the military only in response to Zod. Following from that, in Dawn of Justice, he doesn't actively cultivate a better relationship with humanity, never feels the need to address the public directly to reassure them of his ethics and morals and intentions before being made to by June Finch, especially after everything, and humanity doesn't have a good enough reason to deify him beyond he mighty, so his death being framed as a great loss for the planet is just wasted breath. The only reason why Superman is going to matter to Earth is because of a world-ending threat they've barely started setting up for the next movie. So for Superman's death to mean anything, they have to tie it to the future of the Earth's protection, rather than the fact that a hopeful, moral, decent person who represents the best in all of us has tragically died because we've deliberately written it so Superman's existence is contentious.
Plus, the irony of having Superman be a symbol, with characters talking endlessly about the implications of his existence and questioning his sense of character, is that Superman ends up having no sense of character at all.
I mean, you'd think that a farm boy from Kansas would have several layers of existential horror and confusion at being treated like a god, but unfortunately the movie has the same problem two of the principal characters do. It does not let Superman be a person. There's choice moments like that cute bath scene with Lois, but by and large the movie is positively obsessed with depicting Superman as a god, as a stoic instrument of justice, and in doing so, barely gives him the space to have any of the desirable human qualities that Batman's turning point is supposedly built around recognising. Superman just doesn't really go through much, if at all, in terms of character arc. He doesn't learn anything new about his relationship to humanity or develop it further. He doesn't seem to want or need for anything, and he just decides to pointlessly martyr himself at the end to save Earth from a monster. He barely works as a character because he's treated like a load-bearing symbol to hang the rest of the themes on. This is an example of how the mythic tone actively works against the story and makes it harder to tell, because it makes Superman less comprehensible, and because he's positioned as more of a god than a man, as mentioned, it really takes the sting out of his supposedly weighty death. The only thing he really learns is that humanity, the world he fought to protect in the last movie, remember, is sucky and awful, and sometimes good people are required to do terrible things, which isn't developed in any real meaningful way. It just gets pounded into his head over and over and over again, like so many of Batman's punches. I also kind of get the impression that the storytellers don't like Superman in the sense of how cucked he is by humanity. As in, like, the reason why he can't be a free and cool badass like Batman is because Superman is bound by something so weak and trivial as the court of public opinion. The movie does end up strongly implying, without outright saying, that Superman's relationship with humanity is what's stopping him from achieving greatness. The Dia de Muertos scene is meant to be a visual allusion to that nightmare scene from Man of Steel, and given the nature of the story here, it carries with it the implication that the tragedy of Superman is that he's stuck here on Earth with us. They're trying to present this idea of Superman existing in a corrupt, doomed world, not unlike Krypton before it, that his intentions are just too pure for this world and that his light shines on after death in the example he left behind, just like Jesus Christ. Quick aside, Zack Snyder has a habit of featuring protagonists who martyr themselves to make the world better. Michael kills himself at the end of Dawn of the Dead in order to spare the rest when he's doomed to turn into a zombie. Leonidas and the 300 sacrifice themselves to save the rest of the Greeks. Rorschach has to be sacrificed by Dr. Manhattan because his unbending sense of right and wrong threatens the foundations of Ozymandias' peace. Baby Doll sacrifices herself to the orderlies so Sweet Pea can escape the asylum. And Zod basically makes Superman kill him in order to stop his genocide. By the way, that's not a problem in and of itself. Every artist has their favourite tropes. The core problem here is that the movie is very preoccupied with the idea of Superman and of Superman Optimus priming himself, but doesn't really get Superman and what makes him such an enduring and meaningful superhero. As with Man of Steel, it's enamored with the iconography of Superman and the paratext of what he means to people in our world, but utterly fails to grasp the nuances of who he is, why a man like this would voluntarily do good for the benefit of mankind.
You know, the big challenge, of course, is how if you can make people, feel, what would you do if you were Superman? Which is a thing no one has ever, how would you feel? How do you make that personal? And I think that's the thing that we went after as hard as we could. Because I think that a lot of times, Superman's always kind of this, in the past, this kind of big blue Boy Scout up on a throne that no one can't really touch him, but we try to make him, so he can be out of people. You want to see some. Well.
This is what many people mean when they say that Superman is unrecognisable here, because of the way that the movies treat his altruism and kindness as problems that need to be solved. They don't want a Boy Scout, they want a man of action, someone macho and proactive who does things, goes places, takes matters into his own hands, and everybody else has to just deal.
I mean, what does it say about the creatives that they take a character beloved the world over for his fundamental sense of hope, kindness and goodness and strip him down to a dude who can punch things really hard? I don't want to be that arsehole who says that Zack Snyder is a fake nerd and doesn't get Superman, but at the very least I think it's maybe worth your curiosity that he took it upon himself to fix broken Superman, and this is what he came up with. The American conscience died apparently with Robert, Martin and John, and their modern replacement is this fucking guy.
The main takeaway for me, though, is that the movie has this really weird aversion to character development and resolving threads in a way that actually facilitates that. At almost every opportunity, the movie dodges around making Superman answer for his actions and pins the bad PR on an incomprehensible supervillain who orchestrated the whole thing, because, if it is all just Lex's orchestrations, then Superman has nothing to answer for. Kahina Ziri steps up to vocally challenge the validity of Superman's objective might, but then it reverses and it turns out that she's a stooge for Lex also. Wally gets his own introductory set piece vandalising his statue, but before anything substantive can be said off the back of that, the Capitol explodes. We're given all this talk about what the public think of Superman, but Clark doesn't feel the need to offer his perspective or communicate his own views to the public, nor does the movie really show us what he thinks of his situation. Implicitly, because the movie feels he shouldn't need to, because he's Superman.
I mean, it's why we're even going with a foreign policy disaster that Lex Luthor is secretly behind as the inciting incident, because the filmmakers low-key don't want to acknowledge what people actually thought of the previous movie's ending.
We arrive at the Capitol where suddenly it's potentially interesting, where Superman has a chance to answer tough questions about his role amongst humanity, to potentially defend his decisions and be accountable for the lives lost. But then just everything explodes and we hurry as quickly as we can to Lex blackmailing Superman to fight Batman. Before which, Superman is on exile on Mars, the mountain scene, and has a talk with the spirit of his dead father about how even he made some hard decisions being a hero, but that it was his wife's support that helped him get through it. So, cumulatively, through the way that this is all framed, we end up getting the implication that powerful people being held accountable doesn't actually matter, that tough decisions have to be made, and that the support of the people closest to you are all that matters, that Lois really is the key.
Forget that we're talking about Superman here for a second, and just imagine that this is a story about a politician who's learning about the hardships of being a public figure. They've basically built a story in which the public's concerns aren't really worth listening to, where the politician should just stay true to what he's already been doing, regardless of what the public thinks, and just learn to cope.
So that theme of Superman winning over the public is more or less abandoned, especially since he decides that Lois is his world. As a side note, it really bothers me that Superman's only meaningful human connection is Lois and Martha, and that it's heavily implied that if either of them die, Superman will lose all of his humanity, because that's healthy. Rather than actually dealing with this theme of public perception, they just sidestep and refocus on Lois is the key. They set up a story for him to interact with that doesn't adequately pay off because the movie doesn't really believe that Superman should be held accountable for his actions. Ultimately, it seems that they would rather stab him to death than have him be accountable to anyone.
Superman just doesn't really seem to stand for truth or justice here, because if he did, he would have to be accountable for his actions. Instead, he's basically depicted as a selfish dick whose help Earth happens to need. Nobody is really allowed to question that basic premise of Superman as an Atlas-like figure tasked with holding the rest of us upon his shoulders, because the prominent characters that do either turn up dead or are far too out of their right mind. It's given lip service as a story element, but is treated as if there's objectively no real conflict there.
Quite aside from all of this, Henry Cavill's performance is, I'm afraid, rather muted and dour in a way that's generally off-putting. Now, I don't like getting into the habit of criticising acting on this show, because however one decides to slice it, it almost always comes off as mean or unnecessarily harsh. I actually happen to think that Henry Cavill is a talented actor. I really enjoy him on The Witcher, and he does possess a certain charm and dignity that is very appropriate for the Superman character. But this interpretation of the character on behalf of the director and screenwriters hasn't really allowed him the space to showcase that. I mean, it's a tricky enough job being Superman at the best of times, but it's just that much harder when you've also got to try and make clunkers like this sound anywhere near decent.
Next time they shine your light in the sky, don't go to it.
I'll take you in without breaking you, which is more than you deserve.
You think you can threaten my mother?
No one stays good in this world.
You're a monster, Zod.
And I'm gonna stop you.
Stay down! If I wanted it, you'd be dead already.
Martha!
If you take anything away from this video, it should be that I think that Henry Cavill was done dirty by this series, and I'm certainly not going to be thanking Zack Snyder for it.
Oh, really? So you like that I made your favourite superhero a heroin-addicted jazz critic who's not radioactive?
Just someone, please give this man a decent Superman script. He can carry it. How they work with Batman, on the other hand, is its own can of worms.
The way they've characterised Batman here feels like a naked attempt to outdo Christopher Nolan. It folds into one of the main reasons why Lex's conspiracy plot feels redundant and overcomplicated, but given the way that Batman is characterised in this, he doesn't strike me as the kind of person who needs any extra convincing to kill Superman. I mean, that's the point of opening the movie with the Battle of Metropolis from Bruce's point of view, isn't it?
He has the power to wipe out the entire human race, and if we believe there's even a 1% chance that he is our enemy, we have to take it as an absolute certainty.
Okay, so their big hot take about Batman is that Bruce being Batman is merely a construct of his grief, led blindly by the search for justice into some very morally ugly territory. That's the beautiful lie part of his opening monologue, the falsehood that Bruce being Batman is his salvation, despite the fact that it's resulted in his allies dead and a horrid, crime-riddled city to perpetually sweep up in.
How many good guys are left? How many stayed that way?
I mean, credit where it's due, this is an accurate assessment of how Batman's presence in Gotham doesn't often result in long-term positive ramifications in just about any story he's been involved with. Batman's story here is an attempt to acknowledge that, just like in The Dark Knight, but similarly, it has to also coalesce around Batman being reaffirmed as the hero without much in the way of substantively reforming his character.
So what they're going for here is a fall from grace story, i.e. Bruce has been Batman for 20-something years, his allies are dead, he's become a reactionary shell of his former self, and gets driven to the point where he hunts down a fellow superhero and attempts to kill him. Again, we're going with this idea of the modern world being wicked and spiteful, and look what it's done to the well-being of our beloved caped crusader. There's also something to the notion of Batman's origin being about falling, whilst Superman's is about ascension. If you read between the lines, Bruce's deal is that he's basically looking for surrogate revenge for the death of his parents at the hands of random violence, because after 20 years of being Batman, he's gradually, fatally accepted that closure is just never going to come for him. For Bruce Wayne, his parents' death is the prelapsarian state of grace to which he wishes to return, and in his quest to assemble meaning from that tragedy, he has become further broken and compromised in the attempts to fit the pieces together.
They taught me the world only makes sense if you force it to.
After his anxieties about the future and Superman reach a boiling point with the Capitol, he announces his intent to kill Superman by turning on the bat signal, and in his encounter with Superman, he has a life-altering moment where he recognises Superman's inner humanity and finally achieves surrogate closure by saving his mum from the hands of Lex's goons.
Overall, not a bad outline for a Batman character arc, albeit one on the more extreme end of things than what audiences are typically used to. It is, however, undermined by a couple of important factors.
The first, of lesser importance, is because a large part of the plot involves coercion from Lex, this thread has significantly less impact than it would otherwise have if this was purely about Bruce's anxiety and paranoia boiling over into outright hostility on its own terms, because that way, Bruce driving himself to that point and subsequently discovering Superman's humanity would feel more revelatory for his character. But more importantly, whilst the peacemaking scene after Batman and Superman fight does resolve his antagonism with Superman, it does so in a way that refuses to acknowledge his actual character flaws and thus stops him just short of having a complete arc. So, like, the actual problem with the Martha scene, quite aside from it being unintentionally hilarious and how bafflingly staged it is,
Save Martha!
Is that it centres the scene on Bruce's man pain from having lost his parents rather than an empathetic recognition of those he has severely hurt in his wake, and by doing so manages to completely sidestep any introspection or acknowledgement of wrongdoing on Batman's part.
I mean, Batman acknowledges that Superman might have parents before this.
I bet your parents taught you that you mean something.
So this is entirely concentrated around the name Martha specifically, it seems, which is why it's so funny.
The revelation that Batman and Superman's mothers share the same name has basically nothing to do with the motivating forces that drove Batman to the point where he would kill Superman. It's a tangential reference at best, and if anything, it takes focus away from Superman's humanity and him being in harm's way. As per the movie, the problem isn't that Batman is a reactionary thug who causes severe, often fatal harm to those he encounters, it's that he was tricked by Lex Luthor into almost doing that to the wrong person. Batman being a more fatalistic, extreme, and overtly violent character doesn't have to be a problem, except it is when the movie refuses to acknowledge that these are Bruce's character flaws. That major aspect of his characterization doesn't resolve or grow in any meaningful way. His darkness is framed as a byproduct of his need to make the world make sense, except justice isn't really a part of how he conducts himself as a superhero. Clark's perspective that Batman is some kind of psychotic monster who hunts the poor for sport is well established, but we're not actually given a counter to that. There's no challenge to Clark's accurate assessment there. It doesn't turn out that Batman is misunderstood or is actually more altruistic than he seems, or that Clark comes around to his perspective. Batman just offers to do Superman a favour after he nearly beats him to death, and his cruelty is just never to be mentioned again. It's just sort of brushed under the table that Batman's cruelty to those he encounters is just okay, in a very I won't bring it up if you won't bring it up way, because of how quickly we refocus on
You promise. Martha won't die tonight.
What's more, Batman's vengeance doesn't result in negative outcomes or consequences for his behaviour. Existing problems don't become worse, he doesn't conflict over how effective his own methods are like Superman does, he doesn't become less violent as a result of his encounter with Superman, and he only really loses Alfred's support when it comes to Superman specifically. Dramatically speaking, the movie considers Batman killing Superman to be the absolute low point for his character, and that his entire moral centre will have been completely compromised. And in doing so, it overlooks the innumerable times in which characters are either definitely dead or left in fatal circumstances as a result of Batman's actions.
I say all of this because if this storyline really was supposed to be a criticism of Batman's public conduct as a superhero, these examples are how you actually demonstrate that.
The issue here is that Bruce almost but doesn't have a complete character arc because most of his actual problems that the movie sets up are still left on the table. He achieves symbolic closure by saving Martha, yes, but there's still no consideration for the roomful of dead henchmen it took to get there, and it actively undermines what little development he has. I mean, whilst attaining closure for his dead parents is a potentially powerful and emotional resolution for Batman, it's not the problem of his that actually needs the most solving as far as this story goes, because there's no stakes to that going unresolved.
Like, what does closure even mean if it was blind spite and a reckless disregard for human life that got him here in the first place? It's like the logic of an abuser. Look what my parents' death made me do.
I can imagine someone making a really compelling argument about how Batman's violence is of the same as the violence that took his parents' lives, except for how they're motivated by fundamentally different things. Besides which, highlighting the shared name Martha isn't how you show that, because that takes the focus off Bruce's wrongdoing and it becomes about his pain and not his victims. I mean, that's kind of why we're doing coercion by Lex Luthor as the motivator here, because the alternative would make Batman unambiguously in the wrong, and for all their interest in a dark, fatalistic Batman, they just don't want to go there. So the resolution here isn't to come to terms with how Batman acts like such a blunt instrument in the face of the city he's ostensibly trying to save, it's to not kill the one other super person he knows. And given how much violence he's willing to deal out after this, he doesn't really learn or grow from this experience, he just draws the line at killing this one particular person and also begrudgingly Lex Luthor, because we might need him for the sequels. Also, he's allegedly a shell of his former self, but we aren't actually given a chance to see what Batman's heroics used to look like in order to make that contrast work. This aspect is almost entirely reliant on your metatextual understanding that this isn't your typical Batman. Not to mention, the fact that Batman is depicted in such extremity here makes it just that much harder to empathise with his suicidally paranoid motives to kill Superman, and no amount of filming his parents' death scene like a Chanel commercial is going to change that. I mean, Snyder's Batman is dark, sure, but there's no light within him to contrast it, so we're left with just bleak, grey pessimism. The big issue is that the movie doesn't want to address Batman being a reactionary thug because it doesn't really agree that it's a problem. It doesn't see a potential story hole in Batman also being an off-handed murderer, so establishing Bruce's moral compass in order to directly challenge it later isn't a priority. Just like Superman, he isn't introspective, he kicks ass. The willingness to be gratuitous and in the affirmative of his heroism with regard to Batman's violence completely sucks credibility away from this theme because the movie clearly doesn't believe in it. Like, how you're supposed to feel about Batman jumping into a warehouse and wasting a group of henchmen at the end is unambiguous. This is a celebration of his restored heroics. They basically end up doing the whole Sin City Marv thing of he's damaged but it's okay because it makes his action scenes more cool. The movie handles Batman's violence and psychological pain in bad faith, ultimately, because it needs Batman to generate violent spectacle more than it needs him to atone for his sins. You might say, well, this is just Bruce's character flaws, but there's a difference between that and flaws in characterization. Apparently, the sanctity of human life just isn't a consideration to a guy who lost both parents to an act of random violence. With or without a fall from grace, Batman kills people and the filmmakers don't see a problem with it. There's just no getting around that. He also feels that the entirety of his 20-year career is shruggable because, you know, there'll always be more crime, which is supposed to be his psychological justification for killing Superman, something substantial that will change the destiny of the world as he sees it. But this motivation is emblematic of the overall problem with the characterization of both heroes. They fail to understand the underlying heroics of the two. Like, imagine if this was a nurse or a firefighter saying this, feeling dejected because there'll always be another car crash in that same absolutist way. You'd tell him to get a grip. I mean, I'm quite sure that doctors do sometimes feel like that, but overall, when a doctor or a nurse or a firefighter or a carer helps someone, it doesn't matter if they're creating a lasting heroic legend for themselves because they're not narcissists. They're decent human beings with love in their hearts who are happy for the opportunity to help a fellow person. It's almost as if in a world of Olympians, laser blasting eyes and science zombies, the one thing that they couldn't suspend disbelief for was that Superman and Batman, characters who are pretty well defined by their devotion to others, might prioritise others over their own drama. Incidentally, Frank Miller actually does identify as a libertarian, which goes some way in explaining why his seminal work, The Dark Knight Returns, frames Batman as a rugged individualist revolutionary operating outside the authorities and the law, and places him in opposition of a Superman who's a sellout authoritarian stooge for the government, because libertarianism really is just, you can't tell me what to do, Dad, but as a political position. So, to sum up, we have two protagonists who aren't particularly heroic and we can't emotionally invest in, brought together for a fight that ends in a climax that doesn't work because it doesn't do what it thinks it's doing. Because of its unwillingness to actually get introspective about its characters, it has to cook up a conspiracy plot to bring them together, which can then be thwarted as soon as the two stop fighting and realise they're being played. Because apparently Batman and Superman talking through their feelings or explaining themselves or drawing conclusions about their own sense of self in their respective worlds is just slightly more ridiculous and out the question than Lex Luthor goading a United States Senator with a jar of his own piss. Speaking of which, as depicted in the film, Lex Luthor is basically the world's most determined atheist. Kind of like Kratos. His revised and somewhat vague backstory here is that he was abused by his father as a child, and his hatred for which now manifests outwardly as a giant hang-up about God and power. Okay, so leaving aside the insensitivity of that as the motivation for supervillainy, his plan involves taking advantage of the distrust created by the previous movie's final scenes by media manipulation, tying Superman to a theatre of conspiracies as to create distrust, playing mind games with Batman to motivate him to kill Superman, arranging to have Batman's branding victims killed in prison in order to get Superman to hate Batman, and kidnapping Lois and Martha Kent to get Superman's attention to kill Batman for the world to see the fraud that he is.
Now the cameras are waiting at your ship for the world to see the holes in the holy. Yes, the Almighty comes clean about how dirty he is when it counts. To save Martha, bring me the head of the bat.
And while we're at it, we're just going to casually forget the fact that Superman has X-ray vision and super hearing, so he can just go find Martha, so...
And if all else fails, he's got a big monster in hand from ancient Krypton to destroy him, so yeah, we have all our bases covered. This is kind of a more operatic and extreme interpretation of Lex from the comics, to say the least. Traditionally, Lex is a self-made man who hates Superman because to him, he undermines his achievements in life. He's an egomaniac who believes in accumulating power for its own sake and resents the fact that Superman is the most powerful being in the universe by birth. Across his chronology in the comics, he's an amazing scientist, businessman, multi-billionaire, physically fit, depending on which version of the character you like, but all of that achievement feels for naught if there are just some actual natural superheroes. Some of what the movie does is just take that basic framework and update it to fit a contemporary context, so he's a scatterbrained Silicon Valley type played by the same actor who famously also played Mark Zuckerberg, but the macro of this is to take his inferiority complex to the most logical and existential extreme. Lex Luthor is a mad scientist, new atheist, super genius, absolutely determined to kill God.
The bittersweet pain among men is having knowledge with no power, because that is paradoxical, and thank you for coming.
The idea is, in our mythic analogy, that he's basically evil Prometheus, except instead of stealing fire from the gods, he is actively conspiring for them to kill each other, and thus saves humanity from their wrath.
Though, if you want to keep up the mythic analogy, you could say that Zod's body is the stealing of fire, whom he says flew too close to the sun, like Icarus, but which he uses to create Doomsday, who's referred to as the devil. So it's more likely the case that the Genesis Chamber itself is the stealing of fire, except he doesn't so much bring fire to humanity as he uses that knowledge to kill the gods. I don't know, it's all very muddled and unclear, but regardless, the centre of his character is more or less man must kill God with science. I will say what motivates him to be like that is somewhat vaguely defined by his daddy issues, but whatever, let's just work with it, otherwise we'll be here forever. As far as the DC universe is concerned, Lex Luthor is one of the most brilliantly minded, most resourceful figures, and here he uses it to facilitate and practice extreme nihilism, seeing himself as a prototypical philanthropist who helps humanity by thwarting the heavens, and like Prometheus, sees himself as punished for his efforts, with his torture being the foreknowledge of Steppenwolf's arrival, or something. He presents himself with false magnanimity. He hosts a library benefit and has an open office with a basketball court as though he's down to earth and of the people, but it's actually all just a facade because he uses humanity as his own finger puppets as part of his wider plan to stab God out of the sky. This is supposed to be counterbalanced by the mythological importance of the two title characters and the deep moral need for mythic figures in our horrid universe, and it's ultimately what makes Lex Luthor the villain in this story. He hates the gods so much that he invents the Antichrist to kill them. He literally says that.
If man won't kill God,
2, 1.
The devil will do it.
Taken on its own, it's actually decent. It fulfills the need to be both a dark subversion and also fit into the mythological tone, as well as feeling like such a natural antagonist to this more Atlas-like version of Superman. That said, like so many of the movie's ideas, it feels like another very overcooked concept on top of fundamentally bad framework, because the narrative utility of Lex is really just to cover up plot holes.
So, like, on top of what I've already described, he's also characterised as a super mega genius, which basically means that he's thought of everything and is always correct no matter how baffling or nonsensical his plans or actions may seem. Now, yes, Lex Luthor is a prototypical genius supervillain in the comics, basically the example of exactly this character type, and it's definitely okay for his plan to be a little outrageous, even a tad on the silly side. When it comes to superhero fiction, what the rules are will always be slightly askew because you need to make allowances for people who can fly and shoot lasers out out of their eyes and stuff. But there is a reason why Super Mega Genius is such a dumb and loathed character type, because it's basically an opportunity for the writers to hand-wave away having to characterize him as a smart person, or to actually create a decent mystery for the other characters to solve. They don't really go into much detail about how Lex's plan actually hangs together, as it mostly relies on the assurance that he's a very, very smart boy, so it's just taken as a given that whatever he thinks up will hang together. All that thinking has been done for you. It's a hacky writing trope that's evolved from a halfway decent origin in characters like Gregory House, but later transmogrified into Stephen Moffat's Sherlock, to Henry Carpenter in the Book of Henry, and is more often than not basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for bad storytelling.
The point being that, as per the character trope, Lex Luthor isn't actually smart in the way that humans are smart. In truth, his assumed hyperintelligence is just entirely reliant upon magical plot armor. The real problem with Lex isn't characterization so much as his involvement in the story essentially breaks the entire movie, because so much of the plot is tied back to his off-camera scheming, which the other characters aren't meaningfully allowed to make a dent in, because there's no point where Lex Luthor isn't on the back foot or isn't holding all the cards.
The problem here isn't that Lex Luthor is a smart person, it's that the movie takes full advantage of the convenience that Lex's intelligence is unfathomable and thus doesn't need to be understood. That he's characterized of being such a superior intellect that the story treats him as though he were clairvoyant, as though he could functionally see the future. Now, I do want to stop for a second just to acknowledge and appreciate the fact that writing any genius character in a way that's actually convincing is very hard. It's why there's so few of them, relegated mostly to movies like Good Will Hunting and A Beautiful Mind. I also can definitely see the blueprint of what they wanted to do with this character plot-wise. Like, he's basically an Ozymandias type who thinks of everything and gets the best of our heroes before they can effectively stop him. They even wanted him to have a similar type of master scheme also, involving conspiracy, mass destruction, media manipulation, and the deaths of characters who become inconvenient to the overall picture. But the revelation of it all doesn't really hold the same dramatic weight, because there's not really much in the way of internal logic that holds his plan together, compounded by a not particularly strong and somewhat shape-shifting underlying motivation for this amount of effort to kill Superman.
For real, the more that you unpack it, the less it actually makes sense.
Ultimately, the reason why Lex is like this, and why his plan makes as little sense as it does, is because the creators need a way to move parts of the plot around whilst giving the appearance of internal consistency. In a straightforward nuts and bolts way, what the storytellers need is the following. For Superman to be distrusted by the world, for him to be on the trail of Batman and his criminal branding, for Batman to become openly hostile as he gains access to kryptonite, and for Superman to be somehow dead at the end of the movie. And so to achieve these story goals, they devise a scheme that makes Lex Luthor responsible for all of it, so that way they can neatly resolve the story tension between Batman and Superman in a way that allows them to be unambiguously united for Justice League.
All of that shoddy plotting that we discussed earlier is to get Batman and Superman to engage in a 10-minute fight sequence but then be united afterwards, and they wrote themselves into a story corner that the now infamous Martha scene needed to solve.
Lex Luthor basically has to be characterised as a super mega genius because it covers their tracks for putting together such a shoddy plan. Like, given everything we've previously discussed and the issues with the Discordian plot, all of that is just really easy to hand-wave away if you just go, Lex thinks of everything. Why is Superman fighting Batman? Because Lex is holding Martha hostage. Why is Batman fighting Superman? Because Lex has distorted Superman's image. Why would Superman want to kill Batman? Because of the branding victims that Lex has secretly killed. How is Batman going to kill Superman? With kryptonite that Lex made him steal from him. Why would the world distrust Superman? Because of the African massacre and the capsule explosion that Lex is secretly behind.
It's quite staggering how much of the plot is tied back to the off-camera antics of this one character. Just like in the Book of Henry, Lex and his super genius is made the answer to all of the plot's problems, and it doesn't make you think of how brilliant the character is, it just draws attention to how hack the screenwriting is. It's all just shoddy convenience to get the plot to do what they need it to do.
Calling it a master scheme is being really rather generous. It's more so a series of barely connected moves and counter moves that only make sense if you already know the plot of the movie. It's not really designed to make sense so much as it's designed to pwn the title characters because we're being edgy and deconstructionist and all hope has to be lost before Justice League happens. One of the more glaring holes that I've alluded to is, why is Doomsday Lex's exit strategy? Like, if you know you have access to Zod's body and the Kryptonian chip, in which he'll learn that he can create a monster that can match Superman, then why are we even bothering with working Bruce Wayne into this at all? Doomsday supposedly only answers to Lex, is seemingly unkillable, and he gains access to Zod's body very early in the movie. Like, we're talking 30 minutes in, so this really should be Plan A, except it isn't because they've built the movie around Batman versus Superman. But they need Superman dead at the end of the movie in order to set up Justice League, and they obviously don't want Batman to have to kill him, so Doomsday ends up being the backup plan. If things don't go quite right, he unleashes a world-ending alien monster, you know, that thing that he's been trying to acquire kryptonite to protect the world from, and he just waits to be arrested if the Earth survives. One of the overall problems with the plan is that there's all these elaborate setups which have comically simple results, like how the only reason plot-wise to have a Benghazi-esque foreign policy disaster to open the movie is specifically so Superman can be called to answer for it, during which Lex can blow up the room in order to make Superman further culpable in the eyes of the world. Similarly, he goes all out of his way to divert insurance payments from a former employee of Bruce Wayne's because he needs an activist to testify upon whom a bomb can be planted. Another aspect being that if Lex had just forgotten the whole African massacre, which, I mean, he may as well have, and just went with kidnapping Martha as Plan A, it still would have depended on Batman wanting to kill Superman to the point of obsession and paranoia. But he barely knows Bruce Wayne. I mean, he knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman, sure, but he just assumes somehow that Bruce is also obsessed with Superman, and just a few nudges will push him over the edge in a very, very specific way.
It's as if the only way that Lex Luthor could actually know that Bruce is also hunting Superman is if the twist turns out to be that Lex is actually just David Goyer or Chris Terrio.
Plus, if Bruce at any point acts like a reasonable or even rational person, the plan no longer works. I mean, yes, he's broken and compromised, but that's not the point. He effectively has his brain turned off to make it work. If Batman does anything but pursue and steal the kryptonite shipment from Lex, it doesn't work. If Batman doesn't show up to physically punch Superman where Lex expects, when he expects, as opposed to, say, sniping him in the head with a kryptonite bullet, the plan doesn't work. If Batman, the world's greatest detective, I'll add, makes his own inquiries to discover Clark's identity and attacks him unaware, the plan doesn't work. If Batman, the world's greatest detective, notices a handwriting discrepancy from his employees' checks and realizes he's being played, the plan doesn't work. If Batman is clear-headed enough for Superman to be able to fly down and say, "Hey, my human mother has been kidnapped by Lex Luthor, this is bigger than our man pain, please help," the plan no longer works. But of course, it does all work, because having luck in your favour is apparently the exact same thing as strategic genius.
In terms of his function within the plot, Lex Luthor basically takes the place of the Codex from Man of Steel. He is a thing that the whole movie does not work without.
Storytelling isn't just plot and characters, it's also about theme, and theme is very often forgotten by critics who fixate on pedantic story logic and plot hole hunting, which we've generally tried to avoid. Because just as you can get away with a lot of strange illogical things happening if it makes for a more compelling plot or characterization, you can also forgive a story having something odd going on if it helps develop a central theme. And the trouble is, the themes of Dawn of Justice are just as garbled as everything else. As we mentioned before, the film is big and clumsy with a bunch of disorganized stuff that it doesn't know how to organize, and thus doesn't have an adequate core story, so this results in a lot of thematic baggage.
The film is scattered with the seeds of themes that just never germinated, that either don't work well with all the other stuff or are functionally abandoned as the movie heads towards the climax, some more prominent than others.
Part of this is because there's a lot of awkward, quotey dialogue moments that build to nothing, with also a lot of striking visual moments that prove ultimately to be dead ends. We discussed some of this earlier with Superman learning to be a public figure not developing because the movie fails to engage with Superman actually taking responsibility for the things that he's done, and the whole deconstruction of heroes thing being in bad faith ultimately because the movie needs Batman to be an unambiguous action hero with his brokenness making him seem cooler.
But here are some additional themes.
You're not brave. Men are brave.
So here's the first one, God versus Man. Probably the most coherent theme of Dawn of Justice is a critique of the process by which humanity makes gods out of people like Superman and Batman, and how we both need and kill our gods. We alluded to this earlier. It's originally set up in Man of Steel, where Jor-El proclaims that Kal will be a god amongst humanity, and now we see that manifest as part of the plot for this movie, and of all the things that Dawn of Justice is supposedly about, this is what it's most about. A lot of the plot is centered around Superman's existence and the existential anxiety that creates. There's that crosstalk montage montage where TV pundits discuss the implications of his existence. There's a lot of talk from Lex about how devils actually come from the sky, and him setting up the big fight is framed as God versus man. There's Batman dialogue about humanity as a whole. Batman's monologue at the end is about how it's supposedly humanity's collective failure that caused Superman to die, and that we must rebuild. And credit where it's due, there's a shot I really like the idea of, where Doomsday, the Antichrist remember, looks at the statue of Superman at Heroes Park and then looks down on and dwarfs the real person, as if to belittle the actual Superman and the monstrosity of his myth. The trouble is, as I've argued, that the film can't decide whether the public should love Superman or hate Superman, and his characterization gives them little reason to do either. The only two prominent characters that actually call him a god directly are far too out of their right minds, and we never get a more calm, balanced perspective on how Superman challenges our position in the universe, as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, or perhaps doesn't outside of that talky montage.
Like, maybe he is just a normal guy trying to do the right thing, except perhaps not, because Zack Snyder really wants him to be Jesus Christ, you guys.
This theme is supposedly resolved when Batman is able to see Clark's inner humanity, but then it also needs him to die and be deified as a god, and so trips on its own feet with regards to this theme in the staging of the two funerals, because it really doesn't know how this theme should actually be resolved. The implication is that Superman's public funeral is a show burial whilst Clark's is the real funeral, but the rest of the movie doesn't exactly keep its feet on the ground with regard to this character. It's not like, say, in The Matrix Reloaded, where Neo is regarded as a saviour to those in Zion, but is otherwise uncomfortable with that role, because Superman's godhood isn't treated like something he needs to learn to accept or grow into. And it's not as if the movie goes out of its way to create ambiguity as to the godhood of Superman. It more or less ends up definitely saying that Superman is God and humanity is terrified of him for it.
They don't know how to honor him, except as a soldier.
So another prominent one is Superman as military interventionism metaphor. This is an example of the movie's general reference without depth approach to theme that you also see in other clusterfucks such as Southland Tales. Yes, I went there. So, Nairobi is clearly meant to be a Benghazi-type foreign policy disaster, i.e. a foreign military or quasi-military unilateral intervention that resulted in deaths, a PR nightmare, and a Senate hearing. It's Benghazi but with Superman, and we get people asking the sorts of questions that people ask about American interventionism but with Superman as the stand-in.
I'm not saying he shouldn't act. I'm saying he shouldn't act unilaterally.
Look how grown up the film is, it referenced a news thing. It sets up this idea of using Superman as a proxy for America as a military power, not unlike how Superman has historically been a symbol of American ideals, so potentially leads into a scenario where Superman is made to answer for his acting on America's behalf on the world stage, but as soon as we get to the Senate hearing with June Finch, they decide to not pass this out in a way that actually might have consequences for Superman, because it turns out the Key Naziri is a stooge for Lex and the Capitol explodes. And the second half of the movie will never refer to what happened in Nairobi again.
There's also some wonky attempts at class commentary by highlighting the economic difference between Gotham and Metropolis and how the people of Metropolis routinely belittle Gotham.
Crime wave in Gotham. Other breaking news. Water. Wet.
And now a fight breaks out. Gotham City, you know how they are about their football team.
Watch yourself over there in Gotham. Don't let them take your lunch money.
It just sort of floats around and doesn't really go anywhere at all. Also, this has been pointed out elsewhere, but it bears repeating. How is it that crime is still that bad in a city right next door to where Superman lives? That's either a huge oversight or deliberate selective policing.
This one's a carryover from Man of Steel, but this movie goes even more overt in the 9/11 parallels with the Battle of Metropolis. Characters are trapped in buildings, Bruce's car avoids harshly falling rubble, there's billowing dust clouds of which Bruce plunges himself headfirst into to get to his colleague.
That last one's meant as a cool looking heroic image, but every time I see it I can't help but think that there's no way that Bruce doesn't have severe lung problems after that point.
This has some potential for the exploration of how America was so traumatized by this horrible crime that it collectively lost its mind and moral compass for a decade, but it stays in neutral for almost the entire movie because Bruce's descent doesn't clearly mirror America's, and the comparison is never developed enough to actually say anything. It's topical and evocative imagery on its own, but it also kind of creates confusion with the other themes because Superman is both the American military and also unfairly responsible for 9/11. I also don't really want to touch how Superman is absolutely responsible for his portion of civilian casualties and collateral damage in Man of Steel in a way that immigrants in America are simply not for 9/11. So having Superman also be the victimized immigrant in this story is kind of iffy, though this one is down to clumsiness rather than malice, if you ask me.
to look him in his eye and ask him how he decides which lives count and which ones do not.
This is a good one. So there's a couple of moments in Act 1 where you could be tricked into sensing that the filmmakers had some self-awareness about the kind of film that they were making.
Perry, when you assign a story, you're making a choice about who matters and who's worth it.
These moments sit especially weird within the rest of the film and ultimately end up being rather annoying because at first it looks like a theme is going to be about the significance of ordinary people and the people who sometimes get forgotten in superhero stories. The poor, the powerless, the victims inside the buildings the filmmakers carelessly knocked down in Man of Steel, and the majority of Earth's humans who, like Kahina, were born or live outside the West. But nothing really builds from this because the Nairobi disaster is just a Luthor false flag operation, the witness is a stooge, and once Luthor blows up the capital, it no longer matters and focus doubles on the Anglophone rich boys and the God-Man. And so Dawn of Justice chooses who matters by remaining entirely about the existential angst of the two white male American billionaires and the sun god at the centre of the universe, and they clearly can't summon a real damn about anyone else, which just makes these lines bizarrely discordant with the film that they actually made. Like, maybe these two parts should have just been deleted from the final edit, is what I'm saying.
Those are a collection of themes still left on the table by the film. By and large, it gets by with a lot of visual referencing and symmetry.
As an example, one of the ideas that it proposes is humanity being inherently destructive and violent, a core aspect that needs to be evolved past as spoken by Batman in his final monologue. One of the ways that they show this is in its beginning and ending set pieces. The cannons that mark Superman's funeral is a direct mirror of Joe Chill's gun going off in the Wayne parents' murder, all the way down to the shell casing hitting the floor. It's a Watchmen type moment of visual rhyming. Also, the way that Batman refuses to kill or even brand Lex Luthor at the end is supposed to represent some kind of character change for him, that Superman's death somehow taught him the value of human life. The problem with this, though, is that it's ultimately a hollow gesture because this theme is in stark contrast to how the rest of the violence in the movie is actually framed. Like, its core action set pieces are absolutely framed as a spectacle which the audience is meant to enjoy unambiguously.
I believe you.
Do you see what I mean when I say that this theme is in bad faith? The issue I'm pointing out here isn't one of hypocrisy, it's that the movie has a theme that it just doesn't know what to do with. It hasn't worked out that there's a potential problem between humanity bad because violent and spiteful, and also we need violent spectacle to engage the audience.
More often than not, though, the movie relies on referencing, like how Superman's statue in Heroes Park is deliberately reminiscent of Frederick Marshall's Spirit of Detroit, or how Lois mourning Superman's death is a Pieta sculpture, or the marquee above the movie theatre shows Excalibur as well as the Mask of Zorro, or how Lex's flippable painting is a nod to Gustave Doré's Paradise Lost. Others include Superman's funeral being staged similarly to JFK's, him pulling the ship is akin to Jesus Christ carrying the cross, If You Seek His monument is a nod to St. Paul's Cathedral architect Christopher Wren, and Superman and Doomsday stabbing each other to death is a direct reference to Excalibur, which happens to be Zack Snyder's favourite movie. He did this exact same one in 300 also.
It's what I tend to refer to as depth by association. It kind of looks like depth because it's so overtly posed to make sure that you catch the reference, but doesn't stand for anything on its own because the context is now so different.
And really, the sum total is just compositional signposting. The commonalities here are of heroes, gods, angels, demons, statues, ancientness, grandeur, imagery of which is woven into the very fabric of the movie to suggest something of grand theological consequences occurring before your eyes. You'd be kind of amazed how much of the movie is looking at objects, looking at other characters through the TV, looking at statues, looking at museum artifacts, and of course, Snyder's painterly compositions across the film. There's an attitude here that deeply embraces iconography, but in a very look and don't touch way. But really, though, it's just pop culture evangelism, proselytizing for the theological righteousness of their consumer entertainment product. Nothing really holds together to be called deeper meaning in any traditional sense. It's the same problem that we discussed in the Natural Born Killers episode. It's allegedly ambitious, but its composition just isn't thoughtful enough to justify all the piety and gravitas. The problem with all of this obsession to detail around the edges is that you need a centre, a painting upon which the frame can hang, as it were. And Dawn of Justice just doesn't have a centre. Its moral core is incoherent, characters talk and talk and talk for hours about their metaphorical significance without demonstrating why, the tone is all over the place, and the characters don't have complete arcs. It's just a big bunch of stuff.
Because the movie just doesn't really have depth, it has Easter eggs.
I mean, Dawn of Justice has symbolism and motifs, perhaps so as to insist that it has more on its mind than spectacle and fan service, but that is what we're here for, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just that the movie isn't very good at keeping up the pretense and appears scared of its own shadow. It's a movie that loudly, obnoxiously proselytizes about its paratextual significance, but has no actual depth to back up its ideas. It all obsessively points inward towards the fandom, the lore, the backstory, the details, the cameos, the comic book references and allusions to other stuff. Nothing that really means anything on its own, now stripped from the original context and presented with holy reverence by the filmmaker.
I honestly don't mean to come off as anti-intellectual, like I'm trying to deny the movie the ability to have meaning. Like, if you find stuff in this movie that has real significance to you, then that's really great. You've done better than I have. But from where I'm standing, the movie just isn't designed to have depth. It's designed to facilitate set pieces, and at no point is that more apparent than in its handling of the death of Superman.
Here we go. If you're asking me, the death of Superman is probably the biggest dropped ball in the entirety of the DCEU by many miles, and it does so for basically the same reasons that Superman killing Zod didn't work in Man of Steel. It's entirely reliant upon our understanding that this is an important moment for the character and his universe, even though the story hasn't effectively communicated why. We, the audience, understand that Superman dying is important because we're very culturally familiar with the character and would feel the weight of his loss if he were real and actually died, but what does that actually mean for the character in his own universe? At this point, we're 2 movies deep into the DCEU, and Superman barely has any strong relationship with humanity in a context that's heroic and aspirational, but this moment of self-sacrifice is supposedly the turning point where humanity as a whole recognises him for the Superman he is, as opposed to the despised God-man that they pegged him as. Honestly, when I saw Doomsday show up in the theatre, my heart sank and I slipped into utter boredom because I knew exactly where this was going, and thus had to wait a whole 20 minutes for what was a dead cert, crushed by the knowledge that this just wasn't going to work out for them.
For starters, in terms of his narrative utility, Doomsday has nothing to do with the story of Dawn of Justice because his only real function is to kill Superman and set up the next movie.
Prior to his full appearance, Doomsday has only about 5 whole minutes worth of subplot that is directly about his creation, which is why when he does show up, it feels completely out of nowhere. Now, you might well be thinking Doomsday's birth is a twist in the third act. It's supposed to be a surprise, except for the fact that the action sequence he's a part of is a whole 21 minutes at the very back end.
He's not a twist in the third act so much as he is the third act, because if he was a twist, then surely we would want this cut shorter so then we can get it over with.
But more pertinently, in order for Doomsday to be meaningful as the climax of this movie, you kind of need the plot to be more concerned with his creation. But because the movie is principally about Batman v Superman, he isn't, so his sequence becomes an extraneous action beat after the emotional climax of the main story. He exists for no purpose other than to bring the Trinity together, kill Superman, and inspire the need for the Justice League in future sequels. This is an aspect of the plot that particularly bothers me because of all the things that the movie is juggling. You'd think that they want to prioritise this character and his creation and role in the climax. Doomsday, like so many of the movie's ideas, is seemingly plucked out of DC's toy box for enthusiastic use, but with no strong story purpose or place. He doesn't seem to mean anything to any of the Justice League Trinity. The fact that he's recycled from Zod's body doesn't seem to faze anyone. He means nothing to the general public, and he doesn't stand for anything except for this offhand reference from Lex calling him the devil. I mean, if he is the devil and represents some kind of ultimate evil or culmination of our hero's failure to come together until the very end, then surely the movie would be better at foreshadowing that. But Doomsday simply isn't meaningfully integrated into the rest of the movie. This whole sequence, both Doomsday's birth and subsequent death of Superman, fails to land because the movie isn't written thoroughly enough to lead into it. It honestly feels like a last-minute afterthought if it weren't for the amount of time that it takes up. Plus, there's not really any strong indication that Doomsday's birth specifically is the inevitable result of Batman and Superman failing to see eye to eye. It's not like Batman is overlooking Doomsday in his own pursuit to kill Superman, or had a chance to discover him for himself but failed to. The fact that Doomsday exists isn't in Lex's files that he acquires. His potential presence is a mystery box component of Lex's wider plan, and not a looming threat hanging over the story like a sword of Damocles. Plus, at the same time, it's not as if Lex has Batman and Superman fighting because he's trying to destroy distract them while he creates his science monster. His entire goal is to kill Superman, and so Doomsday is the backup plan for when Superman fails to kill Batman. As such, he doesn't stand for their failure to come together.
Like, if you want to make this work, why not just make Lex's plan world domination with his Doomsday monster, and getting Batman and Superman to fight is his plan to eliminate both of them? I mean, yeah, that is corny and simplistic, but it's acceptable because now Doomsday has a more coherent sense of place. He's Lex's pet monster who does his bidding.
And then there's the second and most important aspect to this, where Superman just doesn't have a thorough enough character arc in order to lead him to the point of sacrificing himself. It's a story element that doesn't have the effects the movie needs it to have. This whole aspect feels like a culminating moment for a character arc that just wasn't set up. Superman ostensibly wants humanity to accept him, but they obviously don't want that to take the form of listening to what the public might want or need from him, and so he just seems to be on a path to begrudgingly do enough good deeds until humanity learns to treat him with deference. The film essentially trips on its own feet trying to make sense of that, because on the one hand they want Superman's existence to be contentious, as well he might be if Superman were real, but on the other hand they need his death to be framed as big an emotional loss as Jesus Christ, and the way that they go about it, one does not effectively create the circumstances to facilitate the other.
Superman sacrificing himself isn't a heroic deed so much as it's a mirror to Jonathan Kent and the Tornado in the previous movie, in that he basically kills himself to win an argument with mankind.
For the most part, this aspect fails because the movie is almost completely lacking in humility with regard to Superman to make this work. They want Superman as an angel, a monument, a god, in order to position him as a deity amongst humanity, as above the society he actively conflicts with, an almost literal Ubermensch, and subsequently his death fails to really mean anything in human terms. This is compounded by how Superman just doesn't really do anything that would win favour with humanity specifically in his final moments. I mean, why this encounter with Doomsday wouldn't be received the same way as his encounter with Zod is just beyond me. You know, alien presence causes untold destruction near a major metropolitan city and is caught on the news somehow reads totally differently if Superman dies at the end, apparently. The last point we're shown what the public think of Superman before his death is the burning effigies after the Capitol explosion, and Superman does nothing to change that perception between when he comes out of exile and his death. I mean, he does suffer Batman's wrath and wins favour with him, and Batman has galaxy brain dialogue about humanity after he dies. In fact, Batman has a lot of dialogue where he talks about men in the abstract.
Men are brave. How many good guys are left?
The terms, good man.
Do you bleed? You were never even a man.
Men are still good.
And I kind of see what they want to do with that. They want to position Batman as like the greatest of all humanity, especially since their big fight is framed as God versus man. But I'm sorry, no. Multi-billion inherited industrial capitalist Bruce Wayne does not work as a stand-in for the best of humanity. In fact, by making Batman the stand-in for humanity in this regard, it once again dodges around Superman having to engage with the public. This is particularly frustrating because it's the exact same bloody problem as how Lois and the military didn't work as a synecdoche for building a bridge with humanity in Man of Steel.
He definitively wins favour with Batman, but not actually the public, despite the story relying on that outcome. It uses the former to infer the latter.
But probably the most important aspect of this is that this act, his sacrifice to save the world from Doomsday, doesn't represent anything that he was failing to do up until this point. He was already willing to do good and save people because we saw his lovingly crafted hero montage. It just isn't effectively built to because it doesn't represent a character change or something that he was struggling with across the movie. By and large, he's struggling with humanity accepting him across two films, and there's nothing that suggests that this action, this great sacrifice, is what's needed for him to achieve that. There's no indication that Superman really needed to die in order to be embraced by mankind. Quite the opposite, in fact, because after the Capitol explosion we're told that the public really wants him dead. He does also conflict over whether his heroism is having a lasting impact on the world, but making a heroic sacrifice at the end doesn't work as the resolution to that, because as soon as he ends up dead, the bell cannot be unrung and Steppenwolf is coming. It's an act that simply does not work as an answer to what the rest of the movie is asking.
It's just staggering on so many levels how much this sequence doesn't work for the reasons that they need it to. They clearly understand the gravitas at play here, but it isn't effectively foreshadowed, it doesn't connect to the rest of the movie in a meaningful way, and nothing actually substantive happens in the interim whilst Superman is gone, so it just begs the question of why did they do this? And the simple answer is hype.
They did it because the death of Superman is one of the hottest selling comics of the 90s, and they wanted a tragic ending that was shocking and dramatic. You know, like what Superman killing Zod was supposed to be. They killed Superman because they needed a sequel hook to create jeopardy for when Steppenwolf shows up looking for mother boxes. But part of that plot is going to be about the League trying to resurrect him as soon as possible anyway, so he can come in for the save in the final battle. They basically just needed Superman out of the plot temporarily, much like Gandalf between Fellowship and Two Towers. When you break it down like that, it's also very unspectacular, because there really are no good story reasons for doing this, especially given what Dawn of Justice has been about up until this point. I also love the fact that they end on the dirt moving on Superman's grave, because they obviously can't trust you to sit with the idea of Superman's death and let that stew, let the dread of his absence linger with you, so they have to leave you with that possibility. They have to imply that Superman might come back because they don't trust you to care about it in the interim, and why would you? We all know full well that Warners don't have the balls to keep him dead, just like they did the last time.
There's a shot at the end, it's about not even a second, few frames of the rocks moving.
Yeah.
Listen, you can't, he's died in the comics, he's come back. You can't, with Warner Brothers, with the merchandising, with the character, there's no way to keep him down. So my question is, when you are deciding to do this, are you already designing, you already know how you're bringing him back? Or are you sort of like, well, we'll figure it out when we're writing Justice League?
Okay, so I laughed like a jackal when I found this footage for the first time, because just the look on his face is just like, uh-oh, what do I tell him? Oh no. I'm not trying to cut him off early, by the way. It's just that, like, Snyder's actual answer isn't that great either.
That challenge, the second you do the first part of it, the death and resurrection are the same thing in a weird way. You have to know. You can't. Here's the reason why I wanted to do it the way we did it was because I don't want the audience completely off the hook with it, right? They still have to like go, what the are you kidding me? Because there's a way to kind of signal toward a more definitive resurrection kind of concept. But I didn't want to do that because I want that to be real for them when they see it, you know, like I want the experience to be real, and then the sort of need be real later on. So suffice it to say, there is a plan, but, you know, that's going to be what you need to wait and see.
So I get the aspect that they didn't want to make it clear if Superman is coming back, but they also need to keep their audience hooked as to how he might come back. So they killed him and didn't definitively signpost Superman's resurrection in order to keep you guessing. I absolutely get that.
But Zach, you've missed the point of the question. We already know that Superman is coming back. And I don't mean we in 2021. We in 2016 knew. He's definitely coming back because Warner's would not let you keep him dead. So Superman's return just is not a surprise, no matter how real you want that moment to be for your audience.
And I just want to be clear about this. I'm not wound up because it's a shocking and dramatic moment like the filmmakers wanted it to be. It's because this is such an incredibly cynical and cheap move on the part of the storytellers. Killing the protagonist of your franchise out of nowhere, just like Optimus Prime, is almost always a shoddy decision because precisely nobody expects them to actually go through with it. Dramatically speaking, pulling this trick almost never accomplishes what it needs to accomplish because the audience is just counting the minutes until the character returns. Especially worse in this case since they have no story to back this up, because in the next movie, as soon as the League discover that Steppenwolf is on the move, they hastily make their preparations to bring Superman back because of course it turns out that Superman really was holding the planet together by sheer virtue of his existence. It's already a cheap trick, made worse by how the story of Dawn of Justice actually plays out. They clearly decided early that they wanted to kill Superman for jeopardy in their sequel, but there just wasn't consideration taken for how it affects the story of this movie by having this moment be the conclusion. This whole section has this really whiplash-inducing effect, and it's just unclear what the actual takeaway is supposed to be, because on the one hand they're trying to get you to engage with the gravitas and seriousness of Superman's death, whilst on the other hand they're also trying to build anticipation for when they unfuck this in the sequel. And what gets me is that if this wasn't Zack Snyder and his collaborators doing this, like if this was a totally different filmmaker doing exactly the same thing, we'd be correctly identifying this as exactly the sort of thing that hacks do to create drama. Like, this is Vince Russo levels of short-term storytelling. They kill Superman out of nowhere thanks to a generic one-note monster coming in far too late into the movie, and they couldn't even be bothered to create a story in which Superman's abrupt absence would actually matter to the world that he lived in. The only way that this makes sense as the ending to this movie is if you're starting backwards from the premise that something big and dramatic needs to happen, because you've got an audience to maintain, movie tickets to sell, and an overall brand to build. The death of Superman, unforgivably wasted as a sequel hook.
They went through with killing one of the most beloved and longest lasting superheroes of all time, whose entire character is built around hope and altruism purely for marketing reasons, purely to build hype for their sequel, and they did it by stabbing him violently in the heart. After ages of umming and erring, this is the reason why I decided to go through with making all of this. This entire sequence is the black heart of the DCEU.
It's an epic mythological event for a character like Superman to go through, but disconnected from his inner humanity, your empathy, and preserves his godliness. He stands for nothing, hasn't accomplished wonders, hasn't become an inspiration to race behind, and he only matters because there's a big bad coming and Earth just so happens to need him. The framing as such does not point toward empathy for a fallen hero, but guilt. This God-man you failed to accept is dead, and the world is poorer for it, because more monsters are coming, and we are lacking our saviour.
God is dead, and we have killed him by rejecting his embrace. It certainly makes you think. It makes me think. I'm not entirely sure that I like cinema anymore. To wrap things up, I feel that we need to talk about the Grand Architect himself, because just as I said earlier, I don't think it's entirely possible to separate Dawn of Justice from who it comes from.
So I know that some are just going to see this entire essay as just another pointless drag on Zack Snyder, which was kind of unavoidable. He was the great helmsman of the DCEU and had huge creative control over Man of Steel, Dawn of Justice, and now his director's cut of Justice League. Taking the credit means taking the blame, and there is so much blame to take here because, as I've passionately argued, I think the movie is bad, okay? But I should just reiterate at this point that the purpose of this essay is to express my own thoughts honestly in critiquing Zack Snyder's filmmaking decisions, and is not meant to be taken or used as an ad hominem attack on Zack Snyder personally, or to speculate about his motives behind the camera. Put bluntly, I don't know Zack Snyder, though frankly neither do you, no matter how many of his Vero posts you may have liked. I don't particularly like Zack Snyder's movies, nor do I or anybody have to, but if this is the kind of thing that matters to you for some reason, he doesn't seem to me to be an evil or malicious guy. Okay? Like, in the name of intellectual honesty, I just can't bring myself to say that he's a bad person. What happened on the set of Justice League completely sucks, the reason why he left is tragic, and he and his wife have done a lot to raise awareness for the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. That said, it also bears noting that the harassment campaign that hashtag released the Snyder Cut more often than not took to get his job back is very not cool, and while Snyder himself cannot be directly blamed for what his fans do in his name, and has recently disavowed problematic people in the movement, one hand does not so thoroughly wash the other, if you see what I mean.
But by all accounts, he isn't assertive, he doesn't yell at people on set, he's not an authoritarian in the way that Michael Bay definitely is. He just strikes me as a kind of laid-back, chill dude bro who perhaps doesn't think too carefully about his own creative decisions. In a number of ways, he actually reminds me of David Benioff and D.B. Wise, the Game of Thrones screenwriters. Not villainous, but just wildly overpromoted given their actual body of work.
Cards on the table, I think that Zack Snyder is a perfectly competent filmmaker who threatens to sometimes be an excellent one when he's able to do something tight and straightforward. This is why his 300 adaptation is so beloved, with its highly questionable politics to one side. But when he's working with a canvas as large as Dawn of Justice, or even Justice League after it, his shortcomings become really obvious as his reach exceeds his grasp. It just comes down to how he's just not very good at telling the story he's tried to craft here. On the whole, his approach strikes me as akin to someone like Todd McFarlane, in the sense that he appears to get caught up in his own aestheticism and doesn't grasp too strongly any overall sense of composition, all style but no particularly strong design to hold it together, which is why his stories almost always read like and this, and this, and this, and this, and this.
As often comes with the territory with commercials and music video directors, he's really good at designing individual sequences, compositions and set pieces, but the whole is almost always less than the sum of the parts, because in order to enjoy it, you need to compartmentalize it highly into the individual good bits. And that's not me saying that I think that commercials and music video directors are inherently lower prospect filmmakers. What I'm saying is that working in that space can often cultivate a certain type of highly image-conscious filmmaker.
One of the chief problems with Zack Snyder's work is that his visuals shout louder than his themes do, and that is because his work has never really been designed to hold dramatic weight. It's designed to look pretty and pluck new surprises out of the toy box. You can have fancy rhetoric, you can be playful with iconography, you can make allusions to deeper stuff, but no matter what high-minded ideals it claims to be about, it will always be principally about violent spectacle. Snyder's universe is, and always has been, a highly aesthetic one, and that's not a diss, by the way, that's just me being purely descriptive. He likes high contrast cinematography, he likes the way that slow motion draws attention to deliberate composition, he likes montage, he likes allegory and iconography, about which he doesn't really do moderation, because go big or go home. He does possess a genuine kid-like enthusiasm for gods, monsters, aliens and superheroes, but it's almost as if he can't stop himself as he compounds source material into the stuff he already likes. RoboCop, Excalibur, Frank Miller, Mad Max, Dragon Ball Z, heavy metal, and he isn't terribly concerned with whether or not you're on board with all of this because he, the auteur, has already decided that it's cool. He's particularly good at appealing to base sensations to create awe and epicness, which is what makes him an ideal suit for the blockbuster arena in the first place, but in pursuit of spectacle he ends up overlooking important aspects such as compelling plot, solid characterization and fully developed themes. Whatever Zack Snyder's issues as a storyteller, it typically hasn't been a problem before, and that's largely down to how his work in the DCU was promising to be something else entirely, something better, deeper, more cerebral, intellectual even. With Superman and Batman here, he wants to be doing a Christopher Nolan, Wachowski sisters, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, genre-redefining, groundbreaking Watchmen type story, and he clearly understands the branding, marketing and hype of that, but he has no real depth to back up his ideas. So here, as is also the case with Watchmen, he boils it down to essentially the memes of his favourite comics and sells it as a blockbuster action movie.
Dawn of Justice aspires for greatness when really it's just another meat-headed popcorn action movie, no different than 300. So it's draped in the aesthetics of intellectualism, dark tone, mythic framing, philosophy, but nothing really hangs together enough to be called meaning any more than an Instagram influencer who posts wiki quotes.
So much has been made of Zack Snyder as a visionary filmmaker, and I definitely understand the thinking behind comparing him to someone like Paul Verhoeven, in the sense that the studio hired him to do a job and he attempted to turn in something way artier than the mass-market corporate franchise schlock required to pass the assignment. It's also why his fans rush to defend him against studio meddling and against criticism, because archetypically he's the artist who made the arty thing, despite the giant capitalist studio that funded it. Terry Gilliam's Brazil, Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop, the Wachowski sisters' The Matrix, David Fincher's Fight Club, and now Zack Snyder's DCEU. But part of the reason, though, why general audiences do get turned off by Zack Snyder's singularly and aggressively dark style is somewhat self-evident. There's an overtly macho, chauvinistic, and somewhat insular quality to his superhero work that sends the message that they're not remotely welcome to outsiders. Already having read The Dark Knight Returns into oblivion is built into the ticket price. There's also a flippantness present in his work towards anything that isn't in favour of his artistic interests. I've neglected to discuss this in detail, but Dawn of Justice in particular has this really spiteful quality to it, perhaps unintentionally. Like, there's a scene where June Finch is goaded by a jar of Lex Luthor's piss right before the Capitol explodes.
I don't actually have anything to say about that other than that I just want to highlight it for posterity and just acknowledge how shitty and overtly mean-spirited that is as a dramatic device. To nick a quote from a master, because it's so relatively extreme within the narrative, it stops being the actions of a character and becomes the decisions of a filmmaker.
Though this mean-spiritedness mostly comes from the fact that Zack Snyder has never had a sensitive hand when it comes to the darkness his stories exist within. He likes dark stories as an artistic preference, but doesn't seem to demonstrate any real care or consideration, and so doesn't have any real respect for the darkness his work so casually wanders into. We pointed this out in our Watchmen episode, but just as an example, his sensibility doesn't really know how to handle the actual seriousness of something like Sally Jupiter's rape. It ends up being constructed like like an action scene with thudding sound effects and leering cinematography. It comes off as flippant to the reality of sexual assault, the intense vulnerability, the stealing of personal agency. Similarly, Snyder knows full well that 9/11 imagery is very emotionally prickly to an audience. It's why he's drawn to it and so willing to depict it in his work. But ultimately, it's used as action movie spectacle. 90s set-piece destruction, but with a palpable sober realness and tragedy to go along with it. It's precisely this attitude as to why his usage of such is often received controversially. It goes the same for how the Amazons supposedly had a way darker origin story. Hell, it especially goes for that now infamous Piety Joker image, a deeply misplaced sense of boundaries being pushed, but with all the nuance of a shitpost. This is all somewhat paralleled by Snyder's assertion in an earlier interview where he said that Batman Begins wasn't as dark as how he'd have handled things, which is to include a sequence where Batman is raped in prison, that could happen in his work. He's willing to go there. This is what I mean when I say that Snyder's work has a flippantness to it. It's as if darkness is just another flavour of chocolate syrup. The same goes with shooting Jimmy Olsen in the head right out of the gate. It has this air of contemptuousness towards all potentially light-hearted elements in superhero fiction, like what those other films are like. Not in our neighbourhood. Same also applies for depicting Robin as being already dead thanks to the Joker. These are narrative devices that are meant to be shocking and dramatic, but for me at least they demonstrate antipathy, principally of the fact that comics have historically been more associated aesthetically with Robin the Boy Wonder, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, Dick Sprang's art style, Adam West's Batman, and Krypto the Superdog more so than anything Frank Miller or Alan Moore have done. This is what people are referring to when they say that the DCU has this rather embarrassed relationship with the source material it cribs from. There ends up being an insecurity on display, as if terrified of its own legacy. This is a flagship mainstream series of movies that leads to the first cinematic depiction of the Justice League, and Snyder, as chief architect of the DCU, wants to make sure that his aesthetic and ideological preferences are a major part of that. In that respect, he is to DC Comics what Michael Bay is to Transformers.
It's a cool point of view to be like, my heroes are still innocent, you know? My heroes didn't fucking, you know, lie to America. My heroes didn't, you know, embezzle money from their my heroes didn't fucking commit any atrocities. I'm like, that's cool, but you're living in a fucking dream world, okay?
Geez, Zach, are you about to throw the rest of the cake too?
Welcome to the real world, jackass!
I find that remark particularly obnoxious and insulting to both mine and his audience's intelligence, by the way. Like, he's being so magnanimous by ripping the fantasy band-aid off for you, that if you don't subscribe to his cruel, macho, profane idea of reality, then you're living in a dream world, which is a bit rich coming from a filmmaker who's trying to look clever, bringing grimdark misery porn to children's pulp characters for a living. It's also an attitude that gets you filmmakers like Todd Phillips, who supposedly made a, quote, real movie by using a Joker project as a disguise. This issue is kind of the root of it for me. I think one of the reasons why folks like me are so angry and resentful is because I've always been a DC fan and that I want to see good DC movies, and so many of us either feel alienated by Zack Snyder's aggressively macho approach or are functionally abandoned. I'm also acknowledged that this is definitely a me problem. In the name of intellectual honesty, I'll freely admit that that is the part that hurts me so much, that I feel basically excluded from what would otherwise be my own fandom, that I despair when I consider that my favourite characters have been seemingly hijacked by filmmakers who don't demonstrate any real respect for what these characters have meant to so many. I don't know. As a fellow content creator and aspiring filmmaker, perhaps I'm just jealous of the fact that Snyder and company are in a position where they can put out any old bollocks they like and nobody is allowed to call them out on it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Snyder got his way. You all win. He returned to Warner Brothers, spent $70 million of their money to finish Justice League, had a decent reception on HBO Max, and Warner Brothers are continuing forward without his input.
The hell are you supposed to be?
Oh my god, we've got a freaking kaiju up in this shit!
Uh-huh. Well, then maybe you will need this. You know what this is?
What?
You're Supergirl. Felicitaciones. Muy bien.
The Snyder era of DC is ostensibly over.
But of course, since Zack Snyder has got his way and had his grand masterpiece finished, we're regretfully talking about hashtag restore the Snyderverse, because apparently if you give fandom an inch, they will take a mile. Your world only makes sense if you force it to, or something. But given everything I've discussed, I can't exactly get on board the hype train, I'm afraid. I feel particularly strongly in this case that the Emperor does indeed have no clothes. I've been burned enough times already. It's really obvious what Zack Snyder's vision for the DCEU was supposed to be. He wanted a story that was legendary and epic, an important cultural monument, The Godfather or The Lord of the Rings of superhero fiction. The talking point of the cinematic universe era. And so many of Zack Snyder's army of zealous fans want that vision to be a reality.
But if the rest of Zack Snyder's grand vision, such as it is anything like Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, it'll be just as big a waste of space. An awful, bloated, dour, rambling, shuffling corpse of a franchise where there is no meaning, only lore.